The night before the buses came, a quiet dread hung over the neighborhood. Families wrapped their belongings in old blankets, children clutched toys they didn't understand they'd soon lose, and fathers stared out of dark windows, pretending to be strong. They didn't know where they were going, only that America, the country they loved, had turned its back on them. Snow hadn't fallen that winter in Los Angeles, but the night carried a strange chill. Paper lanterns swayed above quiet porches, their light trembling like nervous hands. In Little Tokyo, most stores had already closed early. Signs written in hurried brushstrokes read, "Going out of business," or simply, "Closed until further notice." Inside a small two-story wooden house, the Tanaka family sat around their kitchen table. It was cluttered with open suitcases, folded kimonos, a Bible, a baseball glove, and a bundle of letters tied with string. The mother, Hana, tried to smile as she packed each item carefully, but her hands shook. "Take only what you can carry," the government notice had said. "No more than 2 bags per person. No pets, no radios, no cameras, no dignity." Taro, the father, stared at the paper tacked to the wall one last time. He was a gardener, a citizen, a man who had voted in every election since he turned 21. But in bold black letters the notice had erased all that. It read, "All persons of Japanese ancestry, both alien and non-alien, will be evacuated." His son, Kenji, only 12, sat stiff in his chair. He had been born in California, raised on baseball and Saturday matinees, pledging allegiance to the same flag that now seemed to turn its back on him. His mitt was on the table, as if packing it could somehow protect him from what was coming. "Do you think they'll have a field there?" Kenji asked, trying to sound casual, but his voice cracked. Hana stopped folding clothes. She pressed her lips together, fighting tears. "Maybe," she whispered. "Maybe they will." But the truth was, no one knew. The newspapers called it a relocation, the neighbors called it evacuation, the soldiers called it orders. But to the Tanakas it felt like exile. That night, across the entire West Coast, thousands of families like theirs prepared for the unknown. Some burned photographs, letters from Japan, anything that could be used against them. Others prayed. Some pretended it was only temporary. Kenji lay awake on his thin mattress, listening to the silence outside. For the first time, he noticed how quiet the neighborhood was. No children running in the street, no shopkeepers shouting in Japanese, no laughter drifting from the cafe on the corner. It was as if the city itself was holding its breath. And when the first rumble of trucks echoed through the night, he knew that tomorrow everything would change. The morning broke with a dull grey sky. The air felt heavy, as though even the sun refused to rise over what was about to happen. Kenji woke to the sound of boots on pavement, the metallic clank of truck doors, and the low hum of voices that didn't belong to neighbors. From his bedroom window, he saw soldiers in olive uniforms standing on the corner, rifles slung across their shoulders. A green army bus idled nearby, its engine coughing smoke. Painted across the side, in blocky white letters, was a single word: U.S. Army. "Kenji, hurry!" Hana called from the kitchen. She was fastening the last knot around a suitcase. Her face was pale, her lips dry. Kenji pulled his baseball mitt onto his hand like armor. He carried it downstairs, along with the small wooden toy boat his grandfather had carved. Outside, the street was lined with families just like theirs, standing in stiff, nervous rows with luggage at their feet. An old woman clutched a birdcage, though the paper notice had forbidden pets. A young man wore his Sunday suit, polished shoes gleaming, his quiet protest against the humiliation of being herded like cattle. A soldier barked, "Line up! Baggage inspection first!" Taro straightened his back, Gripping the handle of his suitcase, his hands trembled, but his eyes burned with a defiant pride. He whispered to Kenji, "Stand tall, you're an American. Don't let them forget it." When their turn came, a soldier rifled through their bags. He held up Kenji's mitt, turning it in his hands with a sneer. "You planning to play catch where you're going, kid?" Kenji's throat tightened. He wanted to shout, "Yes, I'm going to play. I'm American," but his voice died in his chest. He only nodded. The soldier tossed the mitt back into the suitcase. "Move along," he said. The family climbed onto the bus. Its windows were covered in dust, scratched by years of service. The seats were hard, the air stifling. Around them, whispers filled the silence, children asking where they were going, mothers soothing with lies they didn't believe, fathers clenching fists in helpless rage. Kenji pressed his forehead against the glass. He looked back at the house he had lived in all his life, the wooden porch, the paper lantern still swaying gently in the wind. He tried to memorize every detail, as if by sheer will he could carry it with him. The bus lurched forward. As the streets rolled by, Kenji saw shop windows boarded up, for sale signs hammered into front yards, entire blocks of Little Tokyo stripped bare. It was like watching his world vanish in real time. The city was erasing them, one family at a time. The bus rattled through the streets, past places that once felt like home. Kenji pressed his face against the glass, watching them disappear. Mr. Sato's bakery with its sweet smell of melon bread, the little corner store where he used to trade marbles for candy, the baseball diamond where he had once hit his first home run. Each memory passed by like a funeral procession. Hana sat beside him, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, lips moving silently. Kenji realized she was praying. Across the aisle, Taro's jaw was clenched so hard that a vein throbbed in his temple. He stared straight ahead, as if looking anywhere else might break him. The bus finally left the city. The neighborhoods gave way to open stretches of farmland, where rows of lettuce and strawberries shimmered under the morning light. Kenji thought of the farmers, some of them Japanese, forced to abandon their crops overnight. Who would pick the fruit now? Would their land still be there when they came back? Would they even come back? After hours of silence, the boy behind Kenji started to cry. He was younger, maybe 7, clutching a stuffed rabbit with one ear missing. His mother whispered, "Shh, it's only temporary, just a little while." Kenji wanted to believe her, but the soldiers standing at the front of the bus, rifles at their sides, told another story. At midday, the convoy pulled into a dusty fairground. Soldiers barked orders, herding families off the buses like livestock. The Tanakas stepped onto cracked asphalt. Kenji blinked against the harsh sun. All around him, wooden barracks had been thrown together in uneven rows. They looked more like horse stables than homes. A stench of manure and rot hung in the air. It hit Kenji in the throat, and he gagged. That's when he realized this was a horse stable. The government had converted fairgrounds and racetracks into temporary assembly centers for Japanese Americans. Inside their assigned stall, the walls were smeared with old hay and animal waste. Flies buzzed in the corners. There were no beds, just thin cots on the dirt floor. Hana stood frozen in the doorway, clutching her suitcase. "This can't be," she whispered. But it was. That night, as the sun sank, floodlights snapped on, bathing the camp in a harsh white glow. Kenji lay on his cot, staring at the beams of light cutting through the cracks in the boards. Every creak, every shout of a soldier outside reminded him that freedom was gone. And yet, in that darkness, he whispered to his mitt, curled beside him on the cot, "I'll still play baseball, no matter what. They can't take that away." The first week in the stables felt like a year. The Tanakas lived in a space no bigger than a garage, 4 cots crammed together, the smell of horses seeping into their clothes. Showers were nothing more than communal hoses strung across wooden beams. Privacy vanished overnight. Hannah tried to make the place livable. She swept the dirt floor, hung a scrap of cloth for a curtain, but nothing could erase the humiliation. Every morning, soldiers marched past with rifles, shouting orders as though the families inside were prisoners of war. Kenji carried water in dented buckets, lined up for hours for meals of cold rice and canned peaches. At night, the sounds of babies crying, men coughing, and boots stomping outside made it impossible to sleep. One evening, as the floodlights buzzed overhead, Kenji saw his father sitting outside the stall, his hands folded, shoulders slumped. Taro had always been the strongest man Kenji knew, the one who worked from sunrise to sundown in their garden, the one who smiled even when money was scarce. Now he looked smaller, bent by something heavier than work. "Papa," Kenji whispered, "why are they doing this to us?" Taro's eyes glistened in the glow of the floodlights. He hesitated, searching for words. Finally, he said, "Fear. Fear makes people do cruel things, Kenji. They don't see us as neighbors anymore. They see us as enemies." "But I'm American," Kenji insisted, his voice trembling. "I was born here." Taro reached out and rested a hand on his son's shoulder. "I know, and that's what makes this so wrong. But listen to me. Never let them decide who you are. You carry your dignity inside. No soldier can take that." The next morning, the camp buzzed with new rumors. They were being moved again. The stables were only temporary. The real camps were far away, deep in deserts and mountains. Whispers spread through the lines: Wyoming, Arizona, Arkansas. But one name echoed above the rest, spoken with dread: Manzanar. That night, Kenji lay awake, clutching his mitt. He thought of the word, heavy and strange on his tongue. Manzanar. What would it look like? A town? A prison? Would there be a field to play on? Or only dust? And when the soldiers came the next dawn, shouting for everyone to line up, Kenji knew the last night before Manzanar had arrived. The buses arrived before sunrise, their headlights slicing through the mist. Soldiers barked orders, and families shuffled into lines, clutching their suitcases like lifelines. Children rubbed sleep from their eyes. Elders leaned on canes, moving slowly, every step heavy with disbelief. Kenji held his mitt in one hand, his suitcase in the other. His heart hammered as he looked around. Some neighbors whispered prayers, others stared at the ground, faces blank. It felt less like boarding a bus and more like stepping off the edge of the world. As the Tanakas climbed aboard, Hana turned for one last look at the stable that had been their home. It was nothing but wood and rot, yet she stared at it with a strange sorrow, as though even this humiliation was being taken from them. The ride was long. Hours bled into each other as the convoy wound through endless miles of desert and mountains. The landscape grew harsher, emptier, until nothing remained but dust and stone. Kenji pressed his forehead to the glass, the dry air searing his throat. "Where are we?" he whispered. "Nowhere," Taro muttered, his voice flat. "That's the point." By the time the buses finally pulled off the highway, the sun was sinking. Before them stretched a valley ringed by jagged peaks. Guard towers loomed at each corner, their silhouettes sharp against the fading sky. Rows of tar paper barracks stretched endlessly across the plain, their roofs catching the last light. The wind carried dust that stung the eyes and filled the mouth with grit. A wooden sign at the entrance read, "Manzanar War Relocation Center." Kenji's stomach dropped. This wasn't a town, it wasn't even a camp. It was a prison. As the family stepped off the bus, a soldier waved them forward. "Block 14, Barrack 6, he shouted, barely looking at them. They trudged across the dirt, their shoes sinking into sand. Dust whirled around them, catching in their hair and lashes. Every breath felt like swallowing the desert itself. Their assigned barrack was a drafty shack with walls so thin that daylight leaked through the cracks. Inside, there were no partitions, only a bare bulb dangling from the ceiling and cots lined up against splintered walls. Kenji dropped his suitcase, coughing. Hana pressed a hand to her mouth, trying not to cry. Taro stood in the doorway, silent. His face was carved with something Kenji had never seen before: defeat. That night, as the family huddled together against the desert wind whistling through the cracks, Kenji whispered to himself, "This isn't home, but I'll survive it." And in the darkness of Manzanar, that promise was the only light he had. The days in Manzanar blurred into one another, each coated in dust. The wind never stopped, sharp, merciless, carrying sand that stung the skin and filled every corner of the barracks. Hana tried to keep their space clean, sweeping constantly, but within minutes the floor was covered again. Meals were taken in a mess hall where long lines stretched outside, people clutching tin trays. The food was barely edible: watery stew, overcooked rice, canned vegetables that tasted of tin. Kenji gagged once, and Hana whispered, "Eat, Kenji. You need your strength." The worst part wasn't hunger, though, it was shame. Soldiers watched from the guard towers, rifles glinting in the sun. Barbed wire cut the horizon, hemming them in. The message was clear: you are prisoners in your own country. Kenji clung to his baseball mitt, carrying it everywhere. At first, there was nowhere to play. The yard was just sand and rocks, but one afternoon, a group of older boys dragged scrapwood and rope to mark a field. They set up makeshift bases, stones for first, second, and third, a worn plank for home plate. Kenji's heart soared. The first time he stepped onto that field, the dust billowed with every step, choking the air. But when the ball cracked against the bat, echoing across the barracks, something inside him lit up. For a few moments the fences disappeared, the towers vanished. He was just a boy again, chasing fly balls under the wide desert sky. One evening, after a long game, Kenji returned to the barrack to find his father sitting with a letter in his lap. Taro's hands shook as he held the paper. "What is it, Papa?" Kenji asked. Taro hesitated. "It's from the government," he said quietly. "A loyalty questionnaire." Kenji frowned. "What's that?" "It asks if I will serve in the U.S. Army," Taro explained, voice tight, "and if I will swear loyalty to the United States while we are locked here like criminals." Kenji's chest tightened. "But you already are loyal." Taro's eyes darkened. "Loyalty shouldn't need proving, Kenji, not like this. They want us to say we'll die for a country that won't even let us live free." Kenji didn't understand all of it, but he saw the pain in his father's face. For the first time, he realized the prison wasn't just the barbed wire. It was the wound inside every heart in Manzanar. That night, the wind screamed against the barrack walls, rattling them like bones. Kenji lay awake, mitt against his chest, and wondered how long a person could live in a place designed to break them. Spring brought no relief. If anything, the desert grew harsher. The snow melted from the mountains, leaving the valley dry and cracked. Dust storms rolled through Manzanar like living beasts, turning day into night, forcing families to huddle in their barracks while sand poured in through every crack. Kenji coughed constantly. Hana tore strips of cloth to tie over his mouth and nose, but the grit still seeped into his lungs. At night, she listened to his wheezing and stroked his hair, whispering prayers that never seemed to reach past the barbed wire. And yet, even in this prison, life found ways to persist. Some men dug gardens, carving irrigation channels through the dust until green shoots poked through. Women stitched curtains out of old clothes, pinning them up to create a sense of home. Children chased one another between the rows of barracks, their laughter cutting through the silence like stubborn sunlight. Kenji spent every free moment at the baseball field. The older boys let him join their team, and soon the games became the heartbeat of the camp. People gathered on the edges of the dusty diamond, cheering, clapping, forgetting for a while that they were behind barbed wire. One afternoon, after Kenji hit a line drive that sent the crowd into cheers, he spotted a soldier watching from a guard tower. The man leaned against the rail, his rifle slung casually at his side. For a moment their eyes met. Kenji expected contempt or maybe amusement, but what he saw was something different. Curiosity. Even respect. The soldier raised 2 fingers to his cap, a tiny salute. Kenji's heart thumped. It was the first gesture of humanity he had seen from a uniform since the buses came. But back at the barrack, Taro was silent. The loyalty questionnaire still haunted him. Men argued bitterly about it. Some said refusing was the only dignity left. Others insisted that volunteering proved they belonged. Friendships fractured. Families broke apart. The camp itself seemed to split down the middle. "Papa," Kenji said softly one night, "what will you do?" Taro stared at the cracks in the wall. The floodlight outside painted harsh bars of light across his face. "I don't know," he admitted. "I have already given this country everything. My work, my years, my family, and still they call me enemy." Kenji wanted to tell him it would get better, that someone would realize the mistake, that they would go home soon. But even at 12, he knew lies would not help. Instead, he squeezed his father's hand. And in that silent grip, amid dust and despair, a fragile promise was born that even if the country forgot them, they would not forget each other. Summer in Manzanar was cruel. The desert sun burned without mercy, baking the tar paper barracks until they felt like ovens. Children fainted in the mess hall lines. Men collapsed in the fields where they tried to coax vegetables from the barren soil. At night, the heat gave way to a bone-cutting chill, and families wrapped themselves in thin army blankets that smelled of mothballs. Kenji's mitt cracked from the dry air. The leather stiffened, but he oiled it carefully with scraps of cooking grease, refusing to let it die. Baseball had become more than a game. It was survival. Each swing of the bat, each shout of the crowd was a reminder that they were still human. But the grown-ups' world grew darker. The loyalty questionnaire tore the community apart. Men who answered yes to serving in the U.S. Army were called traitors by those who said no. Fists flew, friendships ended, soldiers patrolled more often, sensing the unrest. Kenji once overheard 2 men arguing outside the barrack. "They lock us up, steal our land, and now they want our sons to fight for them," one spat. "If we don't fight, they'll say we're the enemy for good," the other retorted. Kenji backed away, heart pounding. He didn't understand all the politics, but he understood one thing. Manzanar was splitting in 2. At dinner one night, Hana tried to keep peace. "We must stay together," she said, her voice soft but firm. "No matter what we answer, no matter what they call us, we are family." Taro stared into his bowl of watery soup. His silence weighed heavier than any words. Weeks later, rumors spread of volunteers leaving Manzanar to join the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, the all-Japanese American unit sent to the front lines in Europe. Mothers wept as their sons marched out of the gates in uniforms of the very country that had imprisoned them. Kenji watched from the fence, clutching the barbed wire, as boys barely older than him saluted before boarding trucks. Some waved bravely. Others looked like men already carrying ghosts. That night, Kenji lay awake, mitt against his chest, and whispered into the darkness, "I'll play for them too. I'll remember them." But in the silence that followed, he wondered, would those boys ever come back? And if they did, would there even be a home waiting for them outside the wire? Autumn crept into Manzanar with cold winds that howled through every crack in the barracks. Dust storms grew fiercer, slamming against the thin walls until the whole structure shuddered like it might collapse. The nights were the worst, freezing air knifing through thin blankets, children crying in the dark, elders coughing until dawn. Kenji was taller now, his voice beginning to change. He played baseball almost every day, no matter the weather. Sometimes whole crowds gathered to watch. For a few shining hours the cheers drowned out the guard towers, the barbed wire, the orders barked in English by soldiers who didn't care to know their names. But shadows followed the games home. In the barrack, Hana's hair had started to grey. She moved slower, her body worn down by months of stress and sickness from the dust. Yet she still managed to sew little curtains from scraps of cloth, as if fragile bits of beauty could protect them. One evening, Taro came in with a folded newspaper, his face grim. "The boys of the 442nd, he began, his voice rough. "They're dying in Italy. They say the regiment is one of the most decorated units. But at what cost?" Kenji's stomach twisted. He thought of the young men who had left Manzanar in neat uniforms, some of them waving bravely, some with eyes like stone. Now the desert winds seemed to carry whispers of their names, drifting away like ashes. Later that night, Kenji overheard his parents arguing in hushed voices. "We should never have signed," Taro muttered. "What choice did we have?" Hana shot back. "If we refused, they'd brand us traitors. If we agreed, they sent us to die." Her voice cracked, breaking into sobs. Kenji pressed his pillow over his ears, trying not to hear, but the sound burrowed into him. The next morning, he walked past the fence, staring at the mountains rising in the distance. They looked so close, their snow-capped peaks glowing in the sun. Yet the wire made them untouchable, like a painting nailed to a wall. Kenji clenched his mitt. "Someday," he whispered, "I'll climb those mountains. I'll breathe free air again." Behind him, a guard shifted in the tower, rifle glinting in the light. And Kenji wondered, how long could a boy grow inside a prison before he forgot what freedom felt like? Winter came to Manzanar with biting winds that rattled the barracks like bones. By then, years had passed since the Tanakas had first boarded the bus. Children who arrived with dolls and toy boats were now teenagers with hard eyes. Men who once dreamed of gardens and businesses walked with slumped shoulders, as though the desert had carved the hope out of them. Kenji was nearly 15. His mitt was worn to threads, patched so many times it barely held together, yet he carried it like treasure. Baseball had become more than a game. It was memory, it was resistance, it was proof that joy could exist even in a cage. One evening, word spread through the camp. The war was ending. Germany had surrendered. Japan would soon fall. Families huddled together, listening to the crackling radios in the mess hall. Some cheered, others wept, unsure of what came next. Months later, the gates of Manzanar opened. Soldiers announced that families were free to leave. No apologies, no reparations, just a curt dismissal. You can go home now. But home was gone. Their houses had been sold, their shops looted, their land stolen. Many had nowhere to return. The Tanakas packed what little they had left. Hana's hands trembled as she folded the same clothes she had folded years before. Taro lifted their suitcase, heavier in spirit than in weight. As the family walked toward the buses, Kenji stopped. He turned back to the barracks, to the fields of dust where boys had played baseball under guard towers, where laughter had defied cruelty. He pressed his mitt to his chest. "This place won't break me," he whispered. The bus rumbled to life, carrying them out through the gates. Beyond the wire, the desert stretched wide, the mountains sharp and free against the horizon. Kenji stared at them, his eyes burning, and silently vowed, "One day I will climb them, I will breathe free air again, and I will never forget what they did here." Manzanar was more than a camp, it was a scar across the promise of America, proof of how fear can strip away justice, how prejudice can silence truth. Yet it also became a testament to resilience, to the human spirit that refuses to be erased. Kenji's story is not just history, it is a warning. Freedom is fragile, and it must be guarded not only from enemies abroad, but from injustice within. If this story moved you, subscribe now. More untold stories of courage and survival await.